Well, hello all. This is the second lecture, Chapter 1, the Constitution, and it's a pretty good one. It gives us the idea of the basic structure of our government. So where I would like to start is to tell you a little bit about what I consider to be the important context of the U.S. Constitution, meaning the political environment the Constitution was written. The first important context that you need to understand is the relationship that the United States had with Great Britain and King George III. Now, when you think back on why the colonies were founded in the first place, the whole point was that the colonies were supposed to enrich the king, and they were supposed to exploit the natural resources of the new continent and send these things back to Great Britain. And so when the colonists began to assert their right to more political power, this is a very strange thing. It was sort of unexpected that the people coming, the colonists, would want to become citizens and would want to declare independence against King George III. The colonists considered King George III a tyrant because he made policies without regard to the wishes of the people, so they call him a tyrant. They complained about being taxed without representation. So that leads up to a time when the colonists declared independence. We fought the Revolutionary War starting in 1776. And you can sort of picture them as rebelling against the king, rebelling against the king's tyranny. So the first government that was created after the Revolutionary War was over is a government, the first government of the United States, which is called the Articles of Confederation. And the term confederation refers to a form of government where basically you have a weak federal government, that little box is the federal government, and this federal government is created by states who are very strong. The states get together, they use their power, their authority, to endow a weak federal government with some power, but basically the states are the ones that are important. This is the second context of the Constitution, and what I really want you to know here is after the rebellion, after the Declaration of Independence, the type of government the early colonists wanted was one that was very weak. They were like wanted the exact opposite of the type of government they had under the tyrannical King George. So this form of government, the Confederation, is extremely weak, and it's very different than what we have today. So in a confederation, you have federal government is weak, and that's that little box in the middle, and then the states are strong. Picture that to change the Constitution or to change the Articles, states had to be unanimous. Imagine how hard it would be to get anyone to be unanimous on anything. That's one indication of how weak and how silly the Articles of Confederation were. An event occurred in 1786 that really shows the Articles of Confederation were. So Shays' Rebellion was a rebellion of, I'm trying to get this, I think that works, a rebellion of farmers in Massachusetts. It signifies to me two real big problems with the Articles of Confederation. One was its financial problems. There were financial problems because although the state of Massachusetts was functioning pretty well and Shays did a good job as a farmer, when it came to pay his taxes, there literally was not enough money available for Shays to come up with the actual paper money to pay his taxes. So the state of Massachusetts was going to foreclose on his farm. He was upset, so he decided he would go and get his buddies together, and they would take over the armory in Springfield, Massachusetts. So for many months, Daniel Shays and his buddies, they held that armory. Now picture how hard it would be now to do that kind of thing and not be killed immediately by the federal government. But back in the day, back in 1786, the government was so weak that it couldn't even stand up to Daniel Shays. So the second issue is the issue of defense. Here we just have Daniel Shays, but what if it's the French or the Canadians or the Mexicans or the Indians or the English? If something else happens, it would be very difficult for the government to respond under the Articles of Confederation because there's no central government that tells people what to do. Each of the 13 colonies, they were asked to please help and send troops and send support to deal with this issue. Nobody did it because these things were voluntary. So the government it was impossible for the government to do the things the government should need to do. So Shays' Rebellion should teach you or give you a good example of how weak the Articles of Confederation were and why they weren't successful. So after Shays' Rebellion, a group of guys got together and they realized they needed to change the Articles of Confederation. So they called a convention in 1787 in Philadelphia. The goal was to fix up the Articles, but in fact they basically threw the Articles of Confederation in a trash can and they went for a new form of government. There were 12 states who sent delegates. New Hampshire declined. They had 55 guys show up for the convention. And this picture shows, that's me at Constitution Hall in Philadelphia. So excited to get to go and see Constitution Hall. But you can see the windows, these the actual room that the Constitution was written in. These are the windows right there. So if you wanted to eavesdrop on what was happening in there, all you'd have to do is stand right outside the windows. So in order to keep the proceedings secret, they actually shut the windows. And the big story is it was really hot and very uncomfortable. And so they did it as fast as they could because they all wanted to get out of that hot room. Here they are in their wool wigs and their wool outfits. And, it's super hot in that room. This chair behind, this is George Washington, of course, and this chair behind him, it has a sun on the chair. And one of the things that happened at the end of the convention is they talked about whether the sun was rising, was this a good sign, or was it setting? Like, was America open? And General Washington convinced everyone that the sun, in fact, was rising. And if you go visit Constitution Hall today, they still have the chair. And so you can still see this amazing symbol of the birth of the United States. Right off the bat, the 55 delegates agreed on several things. First of all, they wanted a republic, and republic is a form of government where people elect other people to act on their behalf. So they wanted this republic. And they also realized that the Confederation style of government was a loser, it was a bad idea. And what they really wanted to have was a new kind of government called, the name of our government is actually a federal republic. And a federal republic looks like this, where the federal government is here on top, not in the middle, but it's here supreme over the states. The states are here at the bottom. They exist because the federal government allows them to exist through the Constitution. So this is a radical departure from the government we had under the Articles. We're taking the power away from the states and we're giving it to the federal government. So here the federal is strong and states are relatively weak, much weaker than under the old system. Okay, and another thing they knew is that they wanted to have three branches of government that would exercise shared power within the federal government. So this should sound real familiar, the whole idea of three branches, a triangle here. We have our legislative branch that's going to make the laws, Congress. We have our judicial branch, which is going to interpret the laws, the Supreme Court. And we have the executive branch, the president, who's going to execute the laws. And by putting the powers of government in the hands of these different branches, you're going to reduce the branch. And I always like to share this, especially here in Oklahoma, where we have such a large Native American presence. The framers thought that this was, or they talked about how this was a brand new thing. No one had ever done this before. But Benjamin Franklin had gone and visited a number of Native American tribes in upstate New York, the Iroquois Confederacy, and they practiced a form of government that was very much like this. So on one hand, you have people saying, oh, no, it's never been done before. However, in our own United the Native American tribes, the Haudenosaunee, for example, were exercising this very form of government, and we stole it from them. So we should recognize that the success of our government comes because of the ancient traditions of the Native American tribes. Okay, so there were a lot of agreements, but there were also a lot of conflicts. The first one is over slavery. There are two different fights that we have going on here. We have the fight between the North and South, where they wanted to end slavery and the South wanted to keep slavery. And we also have the fight over large states versus small states. So the first big fight's over slavery. The North says, let's end it. The South says, no, we're going to walk away. You cannot end slavery, or we're not going to be a country together. So slavery would continue, but there would be a deadline, and after that time, you couldn't import any new slaves into the colonies. The second big conflict was over how states would be represented in Congress. So there were two theories on this. The two theories were the New Jersey Plan, and the New Jersey Plan is also known as the Small State Plan. And under the New Jersey Plan, there would be equal representation in each of the houses of Congress. So, for example, each state would get 2 senators, or each state would get an equal representative in the House of Representatives. On the other side, we have the Virginia Plan, which is also known as the Large State Plan. And they said equal representation isn't fair at all, because you have, 50,000 people in New Jersey and 1 million people in Virginia, and how is that fair to have the same number of representatives? So what they proposed is to have proportional representation. And under proportional representation, there would be 1 representative for about every 30,000 people. So if you got a whole bunch of representatives, if you're a small state, you get a couple. Well, you can see where we're heading here. Obviously, this looks very familiar, I should hope, because what we have currently in the United States, the New Jersey Plan is what we have in the Senate, with every state receiving 2. So in the first Congress under the Constitution, there were 26 senators. Today, we have 50 states, 100 senators. And then in the Virginia Plan, that's what we do in the House of Representatives. So you should think that that's really very familiar as well. So back in the day, 1 representative was for 30,000 people, and today, 1 representative serves about 670,000 people, because we have so many more people in the United States. Okay, very well and good. If you're going to use proportional representation based on population, you need to know what the population is. Therefore, it's in the Constitution that we have to have a census every 10 years and count how many people live in each state, so we can figure out how many representatives each state should get. So after this was put out, the southern states were looking at the House and saying, well, all right, this is great, because not only do we have all these white people, we have all these slaves, and we're going to count them too for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. And the North was like, well, that's totally not fair, because these slaves, yes, they live in your state, but you're not going to represent them. You shouldn't count them at all. So you can kind of see how this debate went, counting them 100%, and then they're like 2/3, 1/3, how about 3/5? And so they bargained for the right to count slaves. The South counts the slaves as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation in the United States House of Representatives. So for that reason, I've always hated the fraction 3/5. I think it's to people of African ancestry in the United States, but that's history. That's what happened. So these two conflicts are very closely related. The 3/5 compromise is related both to slavery and to how we represent people in the United States House of Representatives. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the new Constitution, as the framers conceived of it, would fragment power. Now, we talked about democracy, and that's a form of government where the voice of the people comes out into the policies of the government. It's different than a dictatorship, because in a dictatorship, one person can make all the decisions. So this is how I like to picture the idea of fragmenting power. Picture it this way. You have a big ball of power. That's all the power that can be had by the state and federal governments. That looks like an egg. It's supposed to look like a circle. Oh well. But the first way we're going to divide it is we're going to cut it in half. Half of the power belongs to the federal government, like that, and then half of the power belongs to the states. The states are going to check the federal government, and the federal government is going to check the states. The way the Constitution is written is it's a list of the powers the federal government has, and if it's in the Constitution, then the federal government doesn't have that power, and that power is reserved to the states. So it's sort of like if you're rolling out dough, and you take a cookie cutter, and you put it in the middle of the dough, and you cut it out, you've got your little shape. That's the power the federal government has. You take all the rest of the dough off the cutting board and hold it up. That's the power that the states have. If it's not in the Constitution, the federal government gets it. The Constitution is the cookie cutter here. Okay, so not only, number one, do we have the fragmentation between state and federal, number two, we have separation of powers, which I mentioned a moment ago, where the power of the federal government is divided into three. And the power of the state government is divided into three pieces. We have six total pieces, six total parts of the power here. And let me see if I can make this work here. The legislative branch and the federal government, the judicial branch, and the executive branch, they're going to check each other. The power is divided among the three branches of government. So just by the virtue of different people administering different parts of the government, you're going to hold people in check. For example, right now we have a Democratic president, we have a Republican House of Representatives, and a Democratic Senate. Let's say the House and Senate work together, they pass a bill that the Republicans really like. They take this Republican bill and they send it to the president. Well, the president is a Democrat, but the Congress passes the legislation, but the president and the executive branch have to carry it out. Well, that's going to check what the Congress has done just because the president will carry out the legislation in the way that he wants to do it and not in the way that they want him to do it. Okay, so not only do we have separation of powers, but we also have checks and balances where there is a constitutionally mandated role for each of these branches to check the power of the other. Some examples of checks and balances include things like the president's veto power. The president has the veto power over Congress. Congress passes a law, president doesn't like it, veto. That's a check. Another power might be Congress's ability to override the veto. They're checking the president's power. The court has a very important power of judicial review, where it looks at the laws and the actions of the executive branch, and it can declare them unconstitutional and make them go away. So the checks and balances carries even farther the idea of separation of powers. So fragmentation of power is a way to control power, state versus federal, separation of power into three branches, which also exists on the state level, and then checks and balances where each branch has the constitutional duty to check the other branches. Okay. The Constitution was written, and there is a process of ratification that was written into the Constitution. So for the Constitution to go into effect, it would be approved by 9 of the 13 states. Another word for ratification would simply be approved by. So the two groups who are fighting over the Constitution are the Federalists, who like the Constitution, and then the Anti-Federalists, who don't like it. It's easy to remember who's who because the Federalists are the ones who wrote the Constitution. The Constitution also stands for a strong federal government. So if you like the Constitution, you like federal power, you're a Federalist. So obviously the Anti-Federalists are against them, so they're Anti-Federalists. They're more in favor of states' rights, and they think this new Constitution gives the federal government too much power. If you think back to the Articles of Confederation, though, you can see that there was a need for someone to have some more power, or this new country was simply not going to work. See, for example, Shays' Rebellion. The Anti-Federalists also said, beyond the fact that the federal government would have too much power, that the whole reason that we had a revolution in the first place in 1776 was to protect individual liberties. And the Constitution at no point says anything about individual liberties. So the Anti-Federalists wanted a Bill of Rights to be added to the Constitution to say specifically, these are your rights as individuals, as citizens. All right, so James Madison is a famous framer of the Constitution. He was the secretary for the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and he wrote down all the arguments, what everybody said. He embarked on writing a bunch of articles to try to persuade people to ratify the Constitution. So these were called the Federalist Papers, and they think that Madison wrote them because a lot of the arguments that were made in the papers were also made by him at the Constitutional Convention. So another way to think of the Federalist Papers is that they're an ad campaign trying to get people in each of the 13 colonies to please ratify the Constitution. So the most famous Federalist paper was Federalist 51. The most important parts here are the parts in bold. So what it said was, this is in response to the criticism that the new federal government was going to be too strong. Federalist 51 says, but the great security against the gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. So first of all here, he's talking about constitutional means. He's talking about checks and balances. Like if you're the president, your job is to check Congress. If you're the Supreme Court, your job is to check the president, etc. However, he says it's beyond the idea that it's your job, why people should check each other. They will check each other because of their personal motives, their personal ambition, personal jealousies. He says, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interests of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. And maybe, okay, so that's a very important point. He's saying this new government will work, and not only because it's the people's jobs to check each other, but they will see the others getting ahead. And like John Boehner, as Speaker of the House, looks at Obama, he thinks Obama's getting out of hand. He's going to want to step up, not just because it's his job. He's ambitious. And if Obama's getting ahead, then John Boehner's losing. He doesn't want that. So his personal motives are going to cause him, his own petty jealousies are going to cause him to step up, and vice versa with Obama and Boehner. Next phrase, it may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, and he's saying imperfect people over other imperfect people, the great difficulty lies in this: must first enable the government to control the governed, one of the most important things the government does, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. How are we going to avoid another King George III situation? And Madison's answer is through the use of fragmentation of powers and through the use of uniting people's personal ambition to their job. The government will not get out of hand. It will control itself, which is the best thing we can do. Another one of the framers is named Alexander Hamilton. He was trying to address the second point of the anti-federalist argument, which is there was no Bill of Rights for the Constitution. And he said, well, we don't need a Bill of Rights, basically because the Constitution is so perfect. There's no way that anybody's rights could ever be violated. Well, nobody believed that. They thought that was kind of silly. So, memo to Alexander Hamilton from the Anti-Federalists. We want it in writing. Give us a Bill of Rights. They totally didn't buy this argument. All right. However, the Anti-Federalists did like Madison's argument. They did believe in him, and they believed in his argument about personal motives helping to control the U.S. federal government. But they said we still needed to have a Bill of Rights. So they made a bargain with the Federalists. The Anti-Federalists would help the Constitution be ratified if the Federalists would agree to put it in writing, to give us a Bill of Rights. Therefore, very shortly after the Constitution was ratified, we saw the addition of the Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution. Here we have Washington again at the Constitutional Convention and the chair with the sunrise. The Constitution, it was written in 1787. It was ratified, accepted by 9 of 13 states in 1789. So it took about 2 years to ratify. And then shortly after that, 2 years later, we see the addition of first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights, of the Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights in 1791. And these are this is probably the part of the Constitution you're most familiar with. First Amendment, freedom of speech, worship. Fourth Amendment, right against unlawful search and seizure. Fifth Amendment, right against self-incrimination. Right to remain silent, for example. Eighth Amendment, right on unusual punishment. This, without the Anti-Federalists, we would not have the Bill of Rights. So they were really responsible for getting it in writing, getting these things down. Including the Bill of Rights, the Constitution has only been amended 27 times. So 10 times in the first 2 years, and then only 17 times after that. So that's not really bad for a document that it's over 200 years old. One of the things I wanted to share with you is some of the other proposed amendments. I'm trying to push a web page out to you. Hopefully this is opening. If you don't have a pop-up blocker in the way, this should be opening on your page. Proposed amendments to the U.S. Constitution. So as part of your homework, what I'd like you to take a list of these, and if you could add one amendment to the Constitution, I want you to pick one off this list, or you could possibly add one of your own if you don't see what you'd like to add. Anyway, it's we've come a long way. The very last thing I want to add is I like to think of the Constitution as like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, where the context of the Constitution, King George, too strong, the government was too strong, the government under the Articles of Confederation was too weak. The government under the U.S. Constitution, it's like the bowl of porridge that's just right. It's like the bed that's just right. So I always think of it's sort of like Goldilocks. Goldilocks. So the Constitution is really America's Goldilocks story, because we found a government that for us seems to work just right.